The story does not begin in Smyrna. It begins in the pressurized silence of a private jet cabin, somewhere above the Atlantic, in 1970. A pair of aged hands, slightly trembling, still radiating the authority that had once commanded fleets larger than most national navies, moved carefully across a sheet of monogrammed letterhead. The handwriting was deliberate, unhurried, every clause calculated to the last syllable, every word chosen not out of love, but out of anticipation of war. This was the document Aristotle Onassis was drafting for Jackie Kennedy. Not a love letter, a legal trap, a preemptive strike designed to strip her of inheritance the moment she dared to challenge his final wishes. The man who had survived fire, exile, and the contempt of every establishment that had ever tried to exclude him was now, at the unchallenged height of his power, quietly drafting paperwork to protect himself from his own wife. He stipulated that if Jackie contested the will, she would receive only the minimum spousal share permitted under Greek law, and she would bear every cent of the legal costs herself. He wanted her to know, even from beyond the grave, that he had already anticipated her move. That is where this story truly begins. Not in the marble corridors of a shipping empire, not on the glittering deck of the Christina, beneath strings of lanterns and the tinkling of Baccarat crystal, but in the quiet, clinical realization of a man sitting at 30,000 feet, understanding that the only thing left he could actually control was the fine print. That love, power, beauty, and loyalty had all proven, in their own time, to be temporarily rented. Only the clauses in a legal document could be made to hold. Because somewhere across the years and the open sea, love had already abandoned him, and he had never fully recovered from the surprise of it. If the architecture of power and the specific loneliness it always conceals draws you in, stay here. This is not simply the story of a shipping empire. This is the story of what an empire costs when the final invoice arrives. And it is always, without exception, paid in something other than money. Most accounts of Aristotle Onassis open with tobacco hustle and supertanker ambition. The rags to riches arc, the refugee boy who became the richest man in the world. We are going somewhere else entirely. Because the version of this story that matters most, the one that explains the grief, the paranoia, the red cashmere blanket, and the graves on that small Greek island, runs not through any boardroom. It runs through two women that most obituaries mention only in passing, if at all. Eugenia and Tina Livanos, daughters of Stavros Livanos, widely considered the most quietly powerful shipowner in Greece, a man who moved money the way weather moves, without announcement. His daughters grew up surrounded by the particular refinement that old maritime wealth produces, fluent in several languages, educated across European capitals, comfortable at tables where decisions affecting thousands of livelihoods were made between courses. By the early 1950s, both sisters found themselves positioned at the precise center of a rivalry so consuming, so structurally total, that it would quietly hollow out their lives from the inside, without either of them ever having chosen to be part of it. Onassis married Tina. His fiercest competitor, Stavros Niarchos, brother-in-law by that very arrangement, mirror image, and permanent nemesis, married Eugenia. On the surface, two great dynasties, united through matrimony. A tidy consolidation of Greek maritime power. Beneath it, something colder and considerably less tidy. Onassis did not simply want to be wealthier than Niarchos. That would have been manageable, even rational. What he wanted was categorical. He wanted to possess every superlative Niarchos reached for. Every record, every island, every symbol of supremacy the other man desired. Niarchos bought Spetsopolis and shaped it into his own private kingdom. Onassis responded by purchasing Scorpios and importing 200 species of trees, beaches of sand, and an entire hillside to supply fresh water, until barren rock became paradise through the sheer application of will and money. Niarchos commissioned ever larger yachts. Onassis expanded the Christina until it was less a ship than a traveling statement of dominance. The competition never paused. It never softened. It never once paused to acknowledge the human wreckage it was generating in its wake. That wreckage had names. In May 1970, Eugenia Livanos Niarchos was found dead on Spetsopula. The official determination, barbiturate overdose. The bruising observed on her body prompted a formal manslaughter inquiry. The inquiry went nowhere. Charges were considered, then quietly set aside. She was 44 years old. She had given Niarchos 5 children and absorbed, in ways that were never fully documented, the ambient violence of living at the center of a rivalry that treated human beings as incidental to the larger competition. 4 years later, in a development that still requires a moment of stillness to fully register Tina Livanos, by then remarried to Niarchos himself, was found dead in their Paris apartment. Barbiturates, again. Before 50, again. 2 sisters, born into the same household, educated at the same tables, both drawn, by the specific gravity of their world, into the orbit of the same rivalry, both gone before old age could reach them. The Greek maritime world did not speak openly about the symmetry of this. Certain things in that world were understood through silence rather than speech, but the silence, in this case, was not neutral. It was heavy with implication. What deserves to be said plainly is this: while the international press tracked tonnage records and charter rates, and the spectacle of powerful men acquiring ever larger toys, the actual cost of that competition was being paid daily by the people living closest to it. The Livanos sisters were not peripheral to this story. They were its most honest ledger, the clearest record of what this world actually extracted, and from whom, and at what price. There is a detail about the Christina that tends to stop people mid-sentence when they first encounter it. The bar stools at Ari's bar, the ones guests perched on while drinking single malt and watching the Greek coastline drift past at dusk, were upholstered in skin taken from the foreskin of sperm whales. Onassis mentioned this fact to visitors with evident satisfaction. He considered it a talking point, a mark of distinction, evidence that his reach extended to materials no one else had thought or dared to obtain. This is not mythology, it is documented. And it is worth sitting with for a moment, not for the shock of it, but for the precise thing it reveals about the psychology underneath all the marble and the crystal. This was not eccentricity, it was a declaration, executed in upholstery, about the absolute scope of one man's dominion over the natural world, over convention, over the very concept of limits. The message stitched into every bar stool read the same way: there is nothing I cannot claim. Nothing I cannot refashion into an object of my pleasure. Nothing beyond the radius of what I decide to make mine. And yet, and here is where the detail earns its place in this story, it was on those very stools, or within arm's reach of them, that the empire's loneliness made itself most visible. Winston Churchill, in the last years of a life that had shaped the 20th century, sat aboard the Christina in long, ruminative silences. He was aging visibly, retreating from the world, and Onassis, who needed Churchill's reflected greatness, more than Churchill needed the Mediterranean sunshine arranged voyage after voyage to keep him close. The most powerful host in the world was, in this arrangement, also the most obviously needy one. Maria Callas, the woman who had reorganized her entire existence around Aristotle Onassis surrendering concerts, contracts, her marriage, her vocal health, 2 pregnancies learned through a newspaper that he had married Jacqueline Kennedy. Not a phone call, not a private conversation, a newspaper. She was in Paris. She read the headline the way anyone reads something that confirms the worst thing they have spent years hoping would not be confirmed. The lapis lazuli fireplace, rumored to cost $1 per square centimeter, cast its cold blue light across salons named after the very people Onassis had used and outlasted. The Maria Callas Salon, the Winston Churchill Library, the Princess Grace Dining Room, names that flattered and, in their way, entombed. Monuments to relationships that the Christina itself had either facilitated or destroyed. None of the gold generated warmth. None of the marble insulated against the particular cold of a life organized around acquisition rather than attachment. That is the refinement that extreme wealth achieves. When it is wielded the way Onassis wielded it, it does not protect against emptiness. It architecturally perfects it. The corridors become longer. The silences between people become more acoustically precise. The distance between what was spent and what was felt becomes, in the end, the most expensive thing on the ship. The 22nd of January, 1973. Athens. Hellinikon International Airport. Morning. 15 seconds. That is the full duration of Alexander Onassis's final flight, from the moment the right wing of the Piaggio P-136L dropped and refused to recover, to the moment the aircraft cartwheeled into the ground. 15 seconds to undo 5 decades of empire building. 15 seconds to invalidate every supertanker, every island, every clause in every contract his father had ever negotiated. Alexander was 24. He had 1,500 logged flight hours, a commercial pilot's certificate, and a hunger to build something that bore his name rather than his father's. He was quietly planning to resign from Olympic aviation, leave Greece, and marry Fiona Campbell Walter, a former model 16 years his senior, whom Aristotle opposed with the special ferocity he reserved for things he could not control. The planned departure was secret. The flight that morning was supposed to be routine. The aileron control cables, investigators would later determine, had been installed in reverse during a recent maintenance check. Not sabotage, not conspiracy. A technical error, the kind made by tired hands on an ordinary afternoon. The kind that leaves no villain and offers no satisfying target for grief. The right wing dropped on takeoff, and the corrections Alexander applied only worsened the bank, because the cables told the aircraft the opposite of what his hands intended. 15 seconds. Then, silence. Alexander died 27 hours later, on January 23rd, without regaining consciousness. The 2 American co-pilots survived with injuries that healed. Aristotle Onassis, in New York when the call came, collapsed. He flew to Athens immediately. Jackie came with him. Tina arrived with Niarchos beside her, an image so layered with history and irony that those present reportedly struggled to process it in real time. British neurosurgeon Alan Richardson was unequivocal. No meaningful recovery was possible. The damage to Alexander's brain was complete and irreversible. What followed in Onassis was not grief moving through its recognizable stages. It was something more structural, a foundational collapse. The kind that happens when the single assumption holding everything else in place is suddenly removed. Onassis had built the empire with the implicit understanding that it would outlast him, that it would pass to Alexander, that the sacrifice of relationships and presence and warmth would be retroactively justified by the inheritance. Alexander's death did not just take his son, it retroactively emptied the meaning of every choice that had been made in the name of building something worth passing on. He offered $1 million for proof of sabotage. He interrogated mechanics, reviewed maintenance logs, and directed his suspicion, as he increasingly directed all suspicion toward Niarchos. He spoke about the Kennedy curse openly, telling people that Jackie had brought her family's history of catastrophic loss into his bloodline, that the death of 2 Kennedy brothers had somehow migrated, through marriage, into his own family. The respiratory condition he had managed for years accelerated sharply. He stopped sleeping consistently. His weight dropped. The man who had once negotiated supertanker contracts over dinner in 3 languages now spent evenings in near silence, clutching the red cashmere Hermès blanket that Maria Callas had given him during better years. He had chosen not to marry her. He had replaced her, publicly, with the most famous widow in the world. And yet it was her blanket he reached for when the nights became unbearable. In early 1975, he entered the American hospital in Neuilly-sur-Seine. He did not leave. On the 15th of March, 1975, at 69 years old, Aristotle Onassis died of respiratory failure. He was flown back to Scorpios and buried beside the chapel next to his son, 2 graves on an island built for celebration. Christina Onassis was 24 years old when she became the wealthiest woman on the planet. In the 29 months preceding that moment, she had lost her brother, Alexander, her mother, Tina, and her father. 3 people, 3 funerals, an inheritance measured, at the time, at approximately $500 million, and an emotional debt that no currency had ever been designed to service. She had already, by then, cycled through 2 failed marriages. The wealth that made her one of the most recognized names in international finance also made authentic human connection nearly impossible to locate or sustain. Every relationship arrived preloaded with questions she could not answer and motivations she could not verify. She was simultaneously the most sought-after woman in certain circles and one of the most genuinely isolated people within them. She fought clinical depression with a pharmaceutical arsenal that her doctors struggled to regulate: barbiturates, amphetamines, sleeping pills, appetite suppressants. She battled her weight with methods that damaged her heart and her metabolism in ways that compounded quietly over years. She attempted to end her own life at least once during a hospitalization in the period following her father's death. She found and lost moments of stability, then lost them again. In 1985, her fourth marriage to French businessman Thierry Roussel produced a daughter, Athena. Christina poured into that child an intensity of love that spoke directly to everything she had been denied and had failed to find elsewhere. Athena was 3 years old when her mother died, the 19th of November, 1988, a friend's private estate outside Buenos Aires. Christina was found in the bathtub, acute pulmonary edema, the death certificate read. The long arithmetic of pills and despair and a cardiovascular system pushed past its tolerance. More honestly, she was 37. Her ashes were brought back to Scorpios and scattered near the graves of the father who had both fiercely loved her and fundamentally failed to see her as anything beyond an extension of his own legacy. Maria Callas had already preceded her, dying alone in her Paris apartment in September 1977 at 53. Her voice had left her years before her body did. Those who visited her in those final years described a woman of extraordinary stillness, not peace exactly, but the specific quiet of someone who has finished arguing with the life she was given. Her ashes were scattered off the coast of Scorpios at her own request, close enough to the island that the sea, at least, could no longer maintain the distance the living years had forced between them. The Christina was eventually sold, restored, and re-entered service as a luxury charter vessel. The bar stools remain, preserved beneath protective covers. The lapis fireplace still glows for guests who pay the weekly rate and take photographs in the salons named after people whose lives the ship helped unravel. The Alexander S. Onassis Foundation, endowed with 45% of the estate, continues to fund scholarships, medical research, and Greek cultural programs. A monument, quiet and persistent, carrying the name of the son who never lived long enough to build one of his own. Scorpios passed out of family hands in the decades following Christina's death. Plans for a luxury resort have come and gone. The small stone chapel still stands. The graves are still there. The wind that moves through them carries no particular message, but it does not stop either. Athena Onassis Roussel, 3 years old at her mother's death, heiress to the full weight of the name, grew up largely outside Greece, largely outside shipping, largely outside the narrative gravity that had consumed every generation before her. She competes in show jumping at an international level. She speaks carefully in the few interviews she grants. She carries the name the way someone carries an inheritance they did not choose, aware of it, defined by it in others' eyes, and quietly in the process of deciding what it will mean in hers. The empire did not collapse in a trading crisis or a hostile acquisition. It dissolved the way certain things dissolve, through grief passed between generations like a dominant gene, through the compounding interest of loneliness, through the specific exhaustion that accumulates when ambition is the only dialect a family has ever been fluent in. Onassis wrote his will in the air above the Atlantic because he believed that control, extended far enough, could substitute for everything else. For presence, for tenderness, for the willingness to remain. The wind over Scorpios offers a different accounting. You can own an ocean. You can own every supertanker crossing it, every island rising from it, every bar stool and golden tap and fireplace and mosaic floor aboard the ship that carries you across it. You can draft documents at altitude that bind the living to your preferences even after you are gone. And in the end, without exception, without negotiation, all of it resolves into the same few square meters of cold ground on a small island, with the sea nearby and the wind passing over, and no one left who knew you before the money arrived.